Awesome. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Boundaries Workshop with our special guest speaker, Dr. Shainna Ali. We are so excited to host her for today's session. Let me go ahead and pop the chat open. There we go. Wonderful. So this is going to be a little bit more of a free-flowing discussion, and y'all are so lucky that you get this incredible woman to yourself on this call today to learn directly from her, because I know that you all received a signed copy of her workbook, but we get to have her live here with us today. So Dr. Shainna is a mental health counselor, educator, and advocate who's passionate about destigmatizing mental health counseling and helping individuals worldwide recognize the importance of fostering mental wellness. She has published so many amazing books like the Self-Love Workbook, the Self-Love Workbook for Teens, the Self-Love Planner, and the Designing Healthy Boundaries workbook that y'all got. She's also been featured through outlets like ABC, CBS, NPR, Washington Post, and Insider. So Dr. Shainna's passion for promoting mental health awareness and access inspired her to host the Mental Wellness Practice podcast, which I know I shared an episode with y'all kind of in preparation for today's special event. She's the owner and operator of Integrated Counseling Solutions, a strength-based clinical mental health and consulting practice located right here where I am in Central Florida. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Shainna. I will let you take it from here.
First of all, Melissa, thank you so much for hosting me. That was a really kind introduction, and I'm so grateful to have this opportunity. Truth be told, I loved writing the book, but I love getting to speak to people about the content of the book way more. That's actually part of why I created it, was realizing that the struggles that I was facing with boundaries were not my own at all. In private practice, I realized that there were some commonalities. And that's actually where all of my books have come from. But the most recent one being the Boundaries book that you were so fortunate to have from Melissa, that I realize as of late has been and continues to be a prominent concern that a lot of us aren't told how to have healthy boundaries and how to design them. So I'm really glad to have this open discussion. I know that you already have the book, so I was thinking, gosh, I don't want to do a summary of the book. That's a little boring. And thank you everyone for popping in and saying hello. I see those in the chat. I'm going to try to keep them up too. I wanted to offer you a little bit of an aspect of the book that I've been thinking about since the book has been published, and so it's not in there. But I do think it jives with the aspect of the book. And, boundaries are so often perceived as aggressive, firm, direct. And these words, especially when they're associated with women, can seem mean. And don't get me wrong, boundaries can be mean. They absolutely have the potential to do that. But I also encourage us to look at the opposite end. I don't think we get to do that very often. Boundaries can be mean, but on the opposite end altogether, what if they could be kind and caring and maybe even loving? So sit with that for a little moment, because I know when this came to my mind, I had to wait, hold on. I was the kind of person who did not want to say no, did not want to let people down. I was constantly told that like my boundaries, or whether directly or not, were not as important as other people's needs. And I also wanted to be humble in the process. I didn't want to see my boundaries as important as anybody else, or more important than anyone else's. So it was wild for me to start to think of this. And it's something I'll pose in the chat. I know we're going to talk a little bit later in the Q&A, but feel free to chime in. I'm curious if any of you have thought about boundaries ever the opposite end. We're used to seeing it as mean and aggressive and direct, but have you ever given yourself the permission, the opportunity, the privilege to see them as kind, caring, potentially even loving? Now, since I had that revelation, it has really revamped the way I work. It is not just, so we know that it can be mean. Again, I don't want to minimize that, because I'm sure a lot of you have had some unfortunate and challenging experiences with some harsh boundaries. But I firmly believe, and maybe you've already gotten to this from peeking through the book, that our boundaries have to begin with us, not ignoring the world around us, but also empowering through our self love, specifically our self respect and advocacy, to give ourselves the space to see how we hold stake in our boundaries and how all of our boundaries, whether they're with ourselves or with other people, they have to be founded in us first, right? So, with all that being said, a huge part of this whole boundaries are mean thing is saying no. And I'm curious too if any of you have had some struggles with saying no. I think it's a very common experience. Thanks for the head nod, Melissa. I think more people have trouble saying no than not. It's almost universal, I think. And no doesn't have to be a mean word. But okay, let's work with the dichotomy just for a little bit, right? And if no is more mean, aggressive, direct, then does that mean that yes can be a kind word? So I want you to think about healthy boundaries being designed with yes in mind, right? So give yourself an opportunity to think about a boundary that's been challenging for you. And we're going to go through a few questions and we're going to reflect on them, and we can also tie it up together in the Q&A later. But I want you to hold that challenge in mind. I encourage you to think about a boundary that's challenging for you to set. We've all had different types of boundary challenges. It's broken down in the book that sometimes they're hard to receive from others. But again, we're trying to start with the self and come to your core. And in establishing that foundation, think about a boundary that's been hard for you to convey, to set, to communicate. Okay. And I'm just going to give you an arbitrary example to kind of follow along with. So then you'll have your example and you'll have this example that I'm going to give you too. But let's think it's, I am very Halloween-esque. You can see the little skull behind me, maybe. It's 'tis the season. It also means my birthday is near. And I think, Melissa, it means your birthday is near too. So happy early birthday to us. But with all that being said, I've kind of created this little scene around that. So imagine that there's two partners that they met in a lively social atmosphere. A lot of their relationship has been founded in that. And generally, they have a healthy relationship. But one partner has been on a little bit more of a wellness kick, right? So they've been wanting to be a better version of themselves. Not that the other partner doesn't, but one is a little bit more on that journey. And they've realized that they don't want to drink as much and maybe are considering not wanting to drink anymore at all. And they go to an annual Halloween party every single year, and they're realizing now that they might not want to go to this party because they're not sure if it's the environment that suits them. But again, this relationship is kind of built on these social experiences at parties, events, gatherings like this. So keep your example in mind, and I've painted this one to you, and we're going to go through some questions. Themes, maybe they're simple, but they may be helpful questions for you to jot down too. So in thinking about saying yes, I want you to think about first who. As you're setting this boundary, who are you saying yes to, right? So I'm going to come all the way back to that example that I was sharing earlier that many of us relate to is we don't want to say no, right? We don't want to say no to someone else because that means pushing them away. But then we neglect ourselves because when we say no, or when we don't say no, let's work with that one. When we don't say no, then we're saying yes to someone else, and we might be saying no to ourselves, right? So to bring that all in, think about this boundary and who are you saying yes to? So the individual who's kind of wanting to stop drinking or drink less, or just not wanting to be in like debauchery around their wellness, knowing they want to get up for that early workout the next day and have some meditation and be in a good, clear, non-hungover mindset, right? It's helpful to think they're saying yes to their wellness, right? There is the risk, though, of if they don't set that they might be saying yes to their partner, which is fair, right? We do want to be able to compromise, collaborate with, and coexist with our partners. So I see the temptation there. And if they don't set the boundary altogether and just decide to go, don't even set boundaries around their personal consumption, then yeah, they might be saying a lot to other people, saying yes to random folks, someone who purchases a drink, someone who hands them a drink, someone who encourages them to drink, but they may be saying no to themselves. So think about who you're saying yes to. Underneath that, it's important to also think about what you're saying yes to, right? So I've already painted the picture that this person's already on their wellness kick, right? I know a lot of you relate. I know I relate of like, my wellness is very important to me. So that's what I'm saying yes to. It's already established. It's already in there. I already have this class I take on Sunday morning or whatever, right? I don't want to say no to it. So I want to say yes to that. Maybe it's maintaining your goals, being true to yourself, putting your body in optimal form and saying yes to your health. The other end of that is like you might be saying yes to not feeling well, right? Both physically, right, in the example I'm giving, but also mentally of I didn't want to do that. And I did it because I was saying yes to other people and saying no to myself instead. And that can be hard. That what pairs really well with the why. Why are you saying yes? Right? So if I'm saying yes to setting a boundary, not going to this party, or saying I'll go to the party, but I will not be drinking there, right? And please don't encourage me to drink there. Then you might be saying yes because you recognize my health matters, right? And health can coexist. I can both have social wellness, physical wellness, mental wellness, all at the same time. It is possible. We don't always have to give and take. And it's nice when we can get those things that we can check all with. Doesn't always happen. And I think about some more serious examples for a scenario like this. It's kind of painted relatively neutral, common example, at least a common example that I face in my work. But what if it's a little bit more serious? Like labs have been concerning. So the need to want to drink less and, eat a certain way might be related to an underlying health condition. Talk about underlying things. What if there's alcoholism in the family, right? And what if the person themselves has a history with struggling with alcohol? Maybe they have a history of even having a DUI, right? So there may be other reasons that you need to say yes to that boundary. It's not just this small decision, this small party, this one drink. It's actually grounded in something much deeper. And maybe you've already picked this up from the book. I think a lot of times our boundaries are challenging because we set them on a surface level and we don't dig deeper into these whys that are there. And I know Melissa is all about a why. And so this is the big one here. I'm sure it resonates with a lot of the work that you've been doing. So those three questions so far are the type of things that align with the earlier phases of designing healthy boundaries, the reflection and beginning to set. The next two are more of the actionable aspects. That's the assertion, and that's the handling the what may come next and those consequences. So you probably know where this is going. How are you saying yes, right? Is saying yes to your boundary, saying, I'm not going to go at all. I'm not going to put myself at risk and risk all these other whys that I've already established, right? So that's too important to me. You might go for a more firm boundary. I'm not even going to go. You know what? If you go, partner, don't even come close to me, right? It might be more firm. And there are situations that's needed, So I just painted a picture that is a little bit more firm. If there's health reasons, alcoholism in the family, including the individual, there might be a need to go that more firm, right? But then on the opposite end, if it's just, I'm just trying to drink a little less, I don't need to be sober. It's not something that's important for my lifestyle. I like a glass here and there. I'm just saying I don't want to go in over my limit and then regret it the next day, not feel like my best self, et cetera, et cetera. So how are you saying yes to that? Is it showing up and telling your partner, I'm not comfortable drinking at this event? Is it telling other people at the event, I'm not drinking today? Is it telling them also in that moment? Or is it telling them before? And that leads us into the last one, which is when are you saying yes? A lot of times when I'm working with folks around boundaries, we recognize how needed they are in the aftermath. the boundary conflict already happens. And then we're like, whoa, look back. Guess I needed a gate back there. Didn't realize that. And a lot of times we fall into this like guilt and shame spiral of, oh, how did I not know I needed it there? I should have known I needed it there. Had I known I needed it, I could have said it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing is, boundaries will run throughout our lives. Even the healthiest boundary you set today will need to be adapted in some form, likely at some point in your life. That's just how it works. So I think a lot of times we're set to believe not only boundaries have to be rigid, but they have to be so, so, so consistent that they last us forever. It doesn't allow fluidity and flexibility that's a little bit more aligned with the nature of who we are, right? On days that I'm feeling a little bit more vulnerable, I may need to be more protective with my boundaries. On days that I'm feeling strong and I've been clear and consistent about my boundaries with myself and others, I might not need to communicate it as much because they can already probably get where I'm coming from before I even have to say anything, right? But the when is very important. I want you to know that it can happen at any time. The book is a little biased. I'll acknowledge it. I do want us to be as proactive as possible with our boundaries. I think it's one of the more self-advocacy realms that we can take our boundaries into our own hands, and we may not always do that. I don't want them to always be reactive. Even a reactive boundary can be proactive for a future boundary. I think that's really important. So I know I saw some things in the chat and I don't want to miss it. So I would like to kind of check back there, but also Melissa, if you feel comfortable kind of facilitating any key questions that I may have missed, because I don't want to just scan through and ignore.
Yeah, no, I think we were all relating to some of the examples that you were giving, and I saw food came up for a lot of us when it comes to, saying no to, people who are food pushers in our lives. And so I did see Erin say earlier how she would rather be overworked or stressed than to let someone down by saying no. So she's had to start saying no more, but she says that she tends to dwell on it for days afterwards. And I totally relate to that because it's like, oh no, like I feel like I need to be there for them, but it's exhausting, or it's just I don't want to say inconvenient, but sometimes it is for whatever phase you're finding yourself in life.
Yeah, and I really relate to that. And I think that most people in the boundary design process, especially those of us who were not raised being taught how to design healthy boundaries, boundaries were just placed on us, and boundaries were given either directly or indirectly from society. It was just like, just follow along, right? It can be really challenging to start to be in that zone. So I have a lot of empathy for that perspective of like, I'd rather be stressed and overwhelmed. Here, like I have a pit in my stomach because I relate to that so much. And here is where I just want to nudge a little bit. I want to hug it and then I'm going to nudge it. I want to do a little bit of both. And that order is really important.
I love that.
I do a little bit of both. If you are stressed and overwhelmed, are you the best version of yourself for that person then in return? So I think a lot of times, and I know this is clarified in the book, we see boundaries so one-off, like I'm saying this to you right now. I'm saying no in this moment. I'm saying yes in this moment. I'm letting you down in this moment. And we're not seeing how broad it is. And now, to be fair, when we start to expand that scope, it gets a little disorienting and nauseating because it's like, oh my gosh, I'm having trouble with this one little boundary. And you're telling me that this is connected to all the boundaries I've set, especially with this person or in related contexts, and all the boundaries I will set in the future. This was already overwhelming, and you now just made it more overwhelming. I hear that, but it is an entire mindset shift of I firmly believe the times that we continue to, if we have two vats, right, and take out of ourself and to pour into someone else and continue to do it and do it and do it and do it, we can get by to a certain degree. I know we all know what it feels like to get by. And then we're in that burnout realm. That is so risky in a variety of ways. And the most firm way I can share this with you, I know it sounds jarring, so brace, take a breath, is if you are horizontal in any way, because you have been forced to be, right? So I'm thinking lots of people have had to be hospitalized because they've gotten so far into burnout, then you're not actually being helpful to that individual, right? It's not to blame you, right? There's not that. But many times we just see that split second moment of like, oh, how did I get here? Oh, it's high cholesterol or it's some other issue, right? Whatever the thing is. And we don't see, well, how did that develop over time, though? So that's the question I would pose for that. A hug and a nudge. And I hope there's able to make some space for that.
I love that. Yeah, because it's so true. We're so focused on like the outward impact of our choices sometimes that we forget to reflect on how it impacts ourselves as well. And just kind of that ripple effect, like you were sharing. I did want to highlight a comment that Dr. Jen made. She's a veterinarian that's in our group. So I know you appreciate that as well as a dog mom. But she said learning to set boundaries with clients who have sick, ill, or injured animals, and the clients are the ones in charge of their decision to say no to services, which then affects the pets, and the pets have no say. So she's had a challenge learning to implement and stick to those kinds of boundaries. And I know she went through the whole workbook, but she's like, I got to go back and revisit all the activities and prompts.
Yeah, and Dr. Jen, I have a lot of empathy for you there. I'm just thinking, I've worked with a lot of medical professionals, vets included, that are face this juncture sometimes that's you can inform in the best way, but it's not your boundary to make or set. And that can be really heartbreaking. Something I would draw our attention to that's in the book is these different layers of boundaries. And I know I mentioned a little bit earlier too that they start with us, but that they also go into interpersonal. And then there's the social aspect of things. And the social aspect, so first of all, a lot of that is like long withstanding. Like, how do we tend to behave when we're in line? Or how do most of us behave when we're in line? I don't know. There's some general things, you know what I'm saying? But also, the more external we get, that it's not our family, it's not our direct community, it's not our own individual self, we relinquish control. And that can be really challenging because we still have to observe it, and the effects of those boundaries still come back to us. So what's hard about this is that we don't have no control whatsoever, right? So advocating of informing, if this happens, this will happen. The best case is this, right? The standard of care is this, right? That is the best that you can possibly do. Acknowledging the limit of now this is surrendered, right? Like, I can't do more on my behalf, and that's unfortunate. That's a challenge. I also think, maybe this is my bias, I'd be curious what Dr. Jen has to say about this. I think it's a little bit challenging because we have more laws about how to intervene for other humans. That yes, someone's other parenting style, for example, may not jive with mine, but especially as a mandated reporter, if I know that there's some physical abuse happening, it's not a judgment of your parenting style anymore. It's saying that that crosses a line, a societal boundary, right? I'm a little ignorant in that way, but from my experience of having pets throughout my life, unfortunately, we don't have the same type of support for animals that we can intervene in that same way.
Yeah. And I think your point about like reaching the surrender, right, of recognizing like where you don't have that control. Probably, so my mom is also part of the group and she's on the call, and
Yeah.
her parents are definitely challenging a lot of boundaries right now in terms of my grandpa has been in the hospital. His last healthcare provider said, 5 more weeks at the rehab clinic because he got himself hurt. He's okay, but he broke his hip, his pelvis, compound fractured his elbow. And him and my grandma have both just been rushing the process to try to get them back home without anticipating what in the world is that going to look like, and so I know she's had a really hard time reaching that point of having that input to say, I really think you should listen to the doctors. I really think you should listen to the specialists. But ultimately, they have their autonomy. They're going to make their choices.
And that's really hard because it's still a family member, right? So it's not
Exactly.
peripheral. It is like technically peripheral because it sounds like she's not the one who gets to make the decisions.
Mm.
Sometimes that gets a little cloudy, but yeah, I hear that all too well. And this present such a great example. It makes me think about the boundaries that we don't talk about proactively, that then when the time comes, because it feels uncomfortable, right? Like, what happens when we all get older, right? What happens when we need help, when we need support, if we get injured, if we're hospitalized? It makes me think about like all the people who don't have plans for like, what happens if I do pass? Like, what does that mean on my partner or my family or my business or my clients or my work? What does that look like? These are often really uncomfortable questions for folks, existential questions that many times, if we're trying to just get by, whether we can or not, right? Like whether that's within our realm, it means we're neglecting that exploration. And that's why that's such a big part of my work. So the Boundaries book is founded as an extension from the self-love workbook. And a lot of that is we have to talk about these deeper questions, but we're not even going to be able to talk about the deeper questions until we know why for us, right? Like I'm sure being
Mhm.
back home is like a comforting thing, right? I want the comfort. I want to know that this is all done. I want to know we're past it. We can have empathy for that. And also like, well, we want to know he's well. So there's two things being put up against each other and
Mhm.
probably not being discussed in that way either.
Yeah, absolutely. And while my mom is, kind of the observer of this situation, poor Karen sounds like she's right in the middle of a feud between her mom and her sister. So she said they don't get along and she's the middleman trying to be the peacekeeper, and apparently a blow up earlier this week. So yeah, she's in a difficult place right now.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Karen. And that's the thing is that I think a lot of times we don't realize how having these uncomfortable reflections first, setting the boundaries for ourselves, or at least saying, I think this is where I want my boundary, even like negotiating it, because we can have co-created boundaries, right? So you might not be firm on something and say, what do I want to do? I go back to that example of like the party is like, is it better if I don't go, hon? Or is it better if like we go and you just help me to say no? Like what's better? Collaborating with one another. If we treated more boundaries as collaborative, kind, caring, loving, we could
Mm,
address it easier when there's not an issue versus having to all of a sudden, do well when there's an issue. I always say it's easier if you have to have surgery, if you have been healthy or trying to foster your health all along.
yes.
Usually when people have surgery, they have a rude awakening of like how important their health is, and they're starting from really challenging place, and boundaries, it's kind of like that.
Yeah, that's so true. And I have the perspective of, like it is a practice, right? We have to practice setting these boundaries. And I always think from like an animal training perspective, like we have to have that consistency when we're first getting started, right? Because I know an example that I can think of is the first time that you give them that little inch, they're going to take the mile. And I think that's something that I struggle with, is kind of navigating like what that looks like to start with. Like do you go all in and be strict up front, or do you kind of like ease into it? Or I guess it could be very situation dependent.
It is all so situational, but I can still answer a little bit of that. And I can also jive with the animal metaphor because at the end of the day, we're animals, right?
Yes.
So here's the thing I think that happens is people get to the place that they're like, I know I need boundaries. I need to design them. So should I start in a certain way? And I'm like, wait a second, let's also acknowledge you've already started, right? So whether you have actively done it, the process has pre-existed you likely, right? So say someone today realizes like, okay, I do have to start saying no, and they're not much of a no person, more of the people pleasing nature. You're working now with the history of expectation, the history of pattern, right? So if like the dog is used to getting a treat every time they sit, and you just keep doing it and doing it, and they sit and they're like, excuse me, right?
Yep.
That transitional zone, this will be a little bit harder in the beginning because that pendulum is now swinging. Like you always pay for my dinner when we go out, just pulling some arbitrary
Right,
thing out.
right.
So now today, like I didn't even come with my wallet. I didn't even look at the menu, didn't look at the prices. And now out of the first time out of 100 meals, you're going to say, we're going to split this or you pay for it. Right. And from an empathetic standpoint, it's not really fair on the other person either.
Sure.
So it's a little bit of both. I think we need conditioning, both as the person who's setting it or the co-collaborator in setting it, and as the recipient. We're only human. We need that grace. With that being said, boundaries of strong need and danger, those go firm fast,
Yeah.
right? So I mentioned the example of like, if this person just had a DUI, like, let's not teeter around with that. This is like, let's put in firm parameters that you either don't go at all, you take an Uber, you have a driver, whatever the parameters are, we probably need to go firm. So contextual absolutely matters.
That's so helpful. Yeah, thank you for that. Well, I
Yeah.
want to be mindful of the time. So I didn't see any other questions come through. Does anyone have any last minute thoughts for Dr. Shainna before she has to pop off?
Yeah, feel free. I can take a few more minutes if there's some burning questions that I can possibly answer.
I think we touched on some really great points from examples that were shared in the chat. And for my change makers that are on today, like, thank you all so much for your vulnerability too. Like, I know even hearing Dr. Shaina's response to your examples helped me today because I'm moving into a situation of, having to practice boundary setting around wedding planning. And now I'm moving into a leadership role at Beyond the Leash. So it's just all of these things I'm having to now navigate. So really appreciate you sharing your time with us today, Dr. Shainna, seeing lots of gratitude in the chat today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Melissa, for hosting me. And again, in addition to those little questions that I shared with you, I would just tie up with a friendly reminder of allow yourself the space to see that boundaries can be cultivated with love, right? So if you come back to that, like there's no loss that's going to happen, but just don't neglect yourself in the love process, right?
Oh, so good. Oh my gosh. That needs to be a quote in our workbook for for this month.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. You too. Take care.
Bye.